Jim Newman, I'm so grateful that you've taken the time to come talk with me today. You're someone whose work and whose YouTube channel I've spent a lot of time with. Um, Maybe just to start off, if you can talk a little bit about what you do and the kind of the gatherings that you host and sort of what that's like.
Do you mean like what's shared in the meetings?
Yeah, what's shared? What? Yeah, exactly.
Okay, it's it's actually really simple. It's that what is already that. And there's an experience that arises that lives in a illusory, objectified reality.
Mhm.
And in essence, it's not actually looking for that, but that's what's most desired. That I say that because you can't say what this is or what's truly longed for because it can't be known. And so this separate experience arises and seeks, and all it can do is seek objects. It can only seek in the separate reality that it knows. And that seeking and the experience of being separate are dissatisfying. And so it's, in a sense, you could say it's endless. So in the meetings, it's just pointed out that that's illusory. And in that sense, also hopeless because there isn't any separation. And that everything is already what's most desired. Everything is already that.
It's such a unique message because you're not going to find that message in most places that you look. It's such a
Well, in a way you do. You find it sort of everywhere. They
Mhm.
just have a little addendum to it and they tell you what to do about it.
Mhm.
And the way it's seen here is there isn't anyone to tell. There isn't anyone to tell, and there isn't anything that needs to be done.
So part of the context here when I encounter you and I encounter your message is the context of the landscape of like gurus, the landscape of people who are selling something or have a message. And I'm very skeptical of gurus in general. I've read enough stories of all sorts of, abuse of power and things like that. So how do you think about yourself in that context, in the context of people who are in selling or trying to impart a spiritual message?
Oh, yeah, I don't. I'm this. There's no. This doesn't consider. I don't consider myself a guru. Certainly not a teacher. Teaching has to do with imparting knowledge. That would suggest that this knows something that doesn't. That's obviously not the case. Um, so I don't actually.
Yeah. And that's consistent with my experience of your work as well. Um, but it's a hard thing to explain. Like it's hard to explain to someone, um, what I enjoy, let's say in one of these meetings. Um,
Hmm.
to give a potential and way of explaining it now, trying to describe that now. And I wonder how this lands with you. Um, in the best, most complimentary way, in the best way this could possibly be taken, it feels like encountering a great piece of performance art.
Hmm.
Um, and what I mean by this, art at its best, I think, has the ability to shake something in you, to shake people,
Hmm.
to reframe perspective.
Hmm.
But it's such a unique space that you create, and there's of course obviously like a back and forth, and there's a spontaneity and an unknown like sort of tension, chaos that sort of exists in that space. And yeah, I guess that's sort of maybe a way I would describe how I experience it,
Hmm.
as opposed to maybe like a spiritual teacher, who, like as you say, has something to teach or something to impart.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, all I'd have to say to that is that would art seems to have some sort of intention,
Mhm.
and that might be one of the things that people sense at a meeting or in this conversation, that there isn't any intention because there isn't anything that needs to be imparted or is trying to be imparted. There's truly just a response to questions or yeah,
Yeah,
to yeah. There's no drive.
yeah,
I mean, how could there be if this is already that?
yeah.
What's most longed for? What would the intention be? What needs to happen?
I'll just say this, like I imagine myself explaining to the listener now, like trying to help them understand what this is, like what,
Well,
why.
you can't.
Right.
Yeah, you know that this it's already a failed thing. It's nothing to understand. Of course, the concepts, this is already everything, and that there's a separate experience that arises and can only find objects. And in the end, what's longed for is this, which is everything already. That you can explain or describe, but that's not what's being said. Understanding those concepts isn't actually what's being pointed to.
But in the context of one of your gatherings, and if I'm sitting and I'm in the right state of mind, I think I'm there's potentially a receptiveness to
Hmm.
hear this message, where that
Yeah.
message might be something along the lines of like, this is everything,
Hmm.
or something like that. And everything in your experience is saying that this is it. There's nothing else but this.
Well, but that's not what's being said. It's not being said that it's obvious that there's what you're talking about is I think what teachers talk about is now.
Hmm.
In your own experience, all there is now. And that's really not what's being said. That's like an objectification or a reliance on perception. What's being said is that what is that which can't be said already. That fulfillment or the unconditional love or infinite, which is already. That's what's being said. Not that there's a landing point now, but that there's no landing point, because there isn't anything that's not what's longed for, what's truly desired.
Part of the trouble is that people are looking for a program, right?
Yeah.
People come, they're living life. I include myself in this category. Life can feel hard at times, and stressful and difficult, and you could feel very vulnerable, and it could be a drag, and you want some reprieve, you want some respite.
Yeah.
Um, and so people look for that. And your message, I think, can be frustrating to people because
Oh, totally. Well,
they're
this
not.
doesn't give anything to that. Nothing. It has nothing for that experience whatsoever.
That's what I think is so magical about this message. But it doesn't have anything for that. But people still come to you with
Well,
that need.
yeah. Well, what I find is that there's in not everyone, but there's a sort of a mixture. There's something that hears or really enjoys or revels in, um, not being preached to, not being taught, because there's something that already recognizes or knows that it has nothing to do with them. And in that body at the same time, there can be the frustration because it can be the sense that something needs to happen and they want a program to find out how to make that happen. So
Mhm.
I think that both of those can exist in the same body. Of
Right.
course, if there's only the one, if a body shows up and all it has the need for a program, it'll get frustrated and angry and leave. Yeah.
And would you say that seeking is ultimately uh cause of the problem itself? The seeking, you're seeking a solution, but the seeking is ultimately the cause of what you're trying to solve.
Well, it's separation. It's the experience that I'm separate from everything else, or that or that I live in objectified reality. That's the cause. Yeah.
And would you say that so there's a juxtaposition that comes about, it seems, of a strong sense of self versus seeing through that illusion, the self being illusory, I think is something that you would say.
Yeah.
Um, and you would say there's no advantage to seeing
Well,
through
there's
that illusion.
no.
That
Because
also is, yeah, very paradoxical.
well, not see well, in the beginning, what I said was that all there is that which is most desired. And nobody knows what that is. That's never known. But what's most desired is already everything, including the seeking, including the experience of separation, the objectification of everything. So there isn't anything to gain. It's already that way. There is something that might seem to be lost.
Hmm.
When something hears this in a particular body, the individual might have the sense of losing something, of something being lost, which felt like it had, like meaning or purpose or beliefs. Those things can be lost,
Hmm.
but there's nothing to get.
Yeah.
This already being everything isn't waiting for someone to see through it. Isn't waiting for anything. It's already that. All of it is already that.
It's funny. It's funny. It's tough. It's a tough message for people. I mean, I think at times there could be a receptiveness. There could be at times when that can resonate, and feel true in a way. But I'm holding space now for my imagination of audience members feeling very, very frustrated by this message,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I imagine if you're looking for something, it can be very frustrating.
Mhm.
Yeah.
A way that I've approached your message, is that from within the story, let's say, so the story being the conventional understanding of our universe and time and all that. It seems obvious to me that human beings don't have free will. That seems just totally inevitable, because if you claim to have free will, you have to provide a mechanism by
Mm.
which material things can be manipulated by something outside of the laws of nature. It
Right.
just doesn't seem in any way sensible. And
Mm.
so once we say that, once we can agree that free will seems like an illusion, it seems
Yeah.
like a misperception,
Mm.
um, then it follows that, other things can also be illusions and
Mm.
misperceptions. And it seems to me to follow that if there's no free will, then there's really no sense, there's no locus of decision making. There's no
Right.
locus of identity in that way. And it seems that the I also is probably an illusion as well.
Yeah. Well, there's no decision maker, but the brain makes decisions. Like you
Right.
said, those would be, under the same rubric as natural laws, the brain. So the brain does what the brain does. It makes decisions, takes all the information available to it, and comes to a conclusion. Some of the information might be faulty, but that's all it can do. It can't do anything but that. But the decision maker is the illusion.
I wondered from your perspective, if you ever miss being able to complain about things.
Why couldn't complaining happen without a me or an I?
I guess it could.
Yeah. Well, actually, if we get down to it, what I'm suggesting is there isn't an I already. Like you're suggesting isn't already free will. So an I is the experience of that the world is objectified, that there's actually an internal or real subject to the objective reality. And what I'm suggesting is that's already not the case. There is no separate external reality. It's all already that which can't be said.
Right.
So in that way, there already isn't an I that's doing anything.
Hmm. One of the funny things that happens in your meetings, you'll say something very similar to maybe this things you've been saying in this meeting, in our conversation now, that is, and someone will say, "Yes, I understand that,"
Yeah.
and there's sort of like an absurdity there,
Yeah.
because there's I feel like my interpretation of your words is not on the level of understanding.
Hmm.
Um, there's a question people wonder, again, this is now maybe a little philosophical, and we can steer clear of philosophy if you want, but people wonder about consciousness. Is consciousness real? And there's like theories about, panpsychism, maybe consciousness is ubiquitous and everything is conscious. I have a book in front of me, if I could just sort of hold it up and show you. It's a book called Conscience Explained by Daniel C. Dennett.
Yeah.
And he has a line in this book where it's a fairly famous line in this world. He's considered a very important voice in this question of consciousness studies.
Hmm.
He says, in the context of like philosophical zombies, which are like creatures that look like us and act like us but are not conscious. He says, another way to address the possibility of zombies, and in some regards I think it is more satisfying. Are zombies possible? They're not just possible, they're actual. We're all zombies. Nobody is conscious.
Hmm.
And then he goes on to elaborate on that a little more. There's a footnote here that says it would be an act of desperate intellectual dishonesty to quote this assertion out of context. So I'm curious what you think about that. Is there a sense in which consciousness itself is part of the illusion?
Yes. Oh, completely. As far as the individual is concerned, I mean, conscious is just a word, but the experience of being conscious is part of the illusion of being an individual or being separate from everything. It's a form of knowing what is. It's like being conscious of what is.
That's a tough thing to hear for a lot of people, because that's just,
Yeah.
for most of us, myself included, that seems very foreign to, our experience. Daniel Dennett gets a lot of criticism for this perspective. He says, how can a respected philosopher of mind say that, consciousness is an illusion?
Yeah.
But it's interesting to see that relationship there.
Yeah.
What you're saying.
Hmm. Well, the individual can't imagine it not being. It has no idea what we're talking about, and it never will have. It has no idea what this as everything or this as what can't be said is. It has no idea. It can't possibly, because what we're talking about is something that can't be objectified, can't be known.
Mm-hmm.
So it has no relation. The individual lives in a separate reality where its only currency is consciousness. Its only currency is knowing or experiencing. That's how it relates to its entire reality, its entire worldview has to do with its perspective or its knowing. So
Yeah.
yeah, of course it'll be, but the whole message is actually very undermining of that whole experience.
And this is, again, as you said, this is contrary to mainstream spiritual teaching, because in the spiritual traditions that I've read about as well, there's a
Yeah,
sense of cultivating this observer perspective,
that's
being
right.
falling into the state of observation and observing your thoughts, observing reality, and not
Yeah,
identifying with the thought, but identifying with this observer place.
right,
And
right.
I guess I wonder is, as you keep searching for the observer, and you try to observe the observer until you realize there's nowhere to stand, and
That's right.
there's nothing
And
left.
then you have someone that knows there's nowhere to stand.
Mm. Which is back where you started.
Yeah. Well, the idea of a teaching is that there is separation and there's a bridge to wholeness or to um, what is as unspeakable.
Mm-hmm.
And that bridge is just part of the illusion. There isn't any separation, so there isn't any path to find what is already.
Another personal point of reference here. I found this discussion, so to speak, this discussion of non-duality. I became interested in non-duality. And I became interested in non-duality from the perspective of antinatalism. So
What?
antinatalism,
Okay.
it's a philosophical perspective that is very concerned and questions the morality of having children.
Hmm.
And from this perspective, life is quite hard. Um, life is full of, like I said before, vulnerability and pain. And insofar as we believe that it's good to minimize pain, and insofar as we believe it's want to protect human beings from potential suffering, it's hard to justify bringing a child into this world. And from one perspective, I find those arguments very compelling. And
Hmm.
it's hard to, from one perspective, it's hard to, I think, get around that, speaking personally.
Hmm.
But I think your message has a way of undermining some of that perspective. To start with, it undermines, I think, morality altogether.
Yeah, completely.
And so coming to your message from a perspective of grappling with questions of morality, grappling with the question of antinatalism, the ethics of bringing a child into this world, I found that a very interesting conversation.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, all I'd have to say is it doesn't matter. The individual will always be seeking the right way to be, whether it's right or wrong to do this or that. It feels like being right brings it closer in some way to what it wants, the idea that it has of what its life is about, fulfilling meaning and purpose. And it will come up with a myriad of different paths and ideas of the right or the wrong way to be and try to live those. All
Mm-hmm.
in the end, what's longed for behind that is what is already. So it actually is quite irrelevant. And on the other hand, there isn't anyone doing any of that. It's just what happens that as long as there's an illusory experience of separation, they'll be seeking to be right, to get it right.
But the standard theory of life is so absurd. The standard theory of life that we're born into this world and we're
Mm.
so constricted in our options, and we're so, in what we can experience, and we're likely to have all sorts of horrible experiences and suffer tremendously and then just die randomly in a
Mm.
vehicular misadventure.
Mm.
and just sort of just be like, this is it. It's like,
Mm.
it's like intolerably bizarre, you
Yeah.
know?
That's why
And
the individual comes up with beliefs
mhm.
and hope, lives in hope of finding something else, because it finds that intolerable. So it has meaning and purpose, beliefs and hope that sort of buffer it from the experience of being in that bleak reality that you described.
Another angle that I use to sort of get at what you're saying, because again, the point being that I'm getting at what you're saying from a perspective of an outsider, from perspective
Mm.
of distance. I'm trying to get at what you're saying from the perspective of someone who's struggling to get at what you're saying.
Well,
Um,
just, I mean, I appreciate, just to clear up, you can't.
right.
Yeah. It's not possible.
Fair.
It just, there isn't a you.
Right.
That's what's being said. And so all the efforts, one of the core experience of the individual, if it comes to any of these things, is the experience that something has to happen for this to be what it is. And in meetings and people that listen to this, it's the falling away of me, is the idea that that has to happen for this to be what it is already.
Mm-hmm.
And what's actually being said is there already isn't a separate reality. There is only that which is everything. Yeah. So I'm sorry, I
It's
interrupt,
okay. No, it's good. I
but there
appreciate
is
it.
there is no hope
There's no
of
hope.
finding what's being shared. And
I
I just wanted to say one other thing while we're at it.
mhm.
It's not my message. There isn't anybody that could possibly own what's being said.
From the perspective from a background in physics, a question that comes up in the world's in the study of cosmology is, what does our universe contain? What's in our universe? And we assume our universe is very large and it contains a lot, and we might even live in a multiverse according to
Yeah.
modern scientific theories. And
Yeah.
so in this conception, it seems pretty inevitable that there exist these things called Boltzmann brains.
Yeah.
So this idea being that a human brain, in the story, we have these human brains that are simulating a consciousness. If the universe is sufficiently large and sufficiently chaotic, you would imagine that in that chaos, in that infinite soup, a brain could just assemble randomly in a soup of chaos and then
Mm.
dissolve itself a moment later. But
Mm.
you'd have a flicker, an instantaneous flicker of consciousness
Mm.
in somewhere flickering in and out of existence in the multiverse. And it seems we don't know that we're not that. We don't know we're not a Boltzmann brain, just
Yeah.
flickering instantaneously this moment that
Yeah.
we are currently experiencing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you really don't know anything. The eye really doesn't know anything. It has a series. The experience of knowing comes out of a contracted energy in the body, and
Mm-hmm.
out of that it extrapolates the knowing of everything around it. But all of that is just part of the illusion of separation.
So for me, I feel like that for me is a kind of a hook where epistemologically I can say, if I don't know that I'm not a Boltzmann brain,
Hmm.
then I can rest more in that unknowing.
Hmm. Oh, well, nobody can rest in unknowing. This literally, it's just about there not being a you, not a you that can come to terms with the fact that it doesn't know. I actually hear that not so seldomly. People who've had maybe enlightenment experiences or other insights, that they've come to a position that they know they can't know everything. It's too complex and complicated. So there's sort of an acceptance that they can't know. And that's just not what's being said here. What's being said here is that the knower itself is an illusion, and that what's longed for is not objectifiable and is already everything.
People might ask, I'm sure you get this question a lot. This is probably a very common question, but why is this not nihilism? If the message includes no morality, how is that different from nihilism?
Because it isn't suggesting there's a person who um, is in that state that you described a while ago. It's suggesting there isn't a person.
Right.
Nihilism relates to an individual that's in a particular predicament of having no God or no hope. I don't know exactly what it is. And
Nothing
that's
matters.
not,
Yeah.
nothing matters. And that's not what this is saying. For the individual, it will always matter. But what's being said is there is no individual.
Another thing which you say, which I find surprising, although not too surprising. It's surprising at first, maybe, but the sense that there's a permanence to this kind of realization, because
Hmm.
a lot of people, as you
Well, there
know,
isn't.
there isn't. Okay. So people talk about glimpses,
Yeah.
but what I think you're describing is a more something more permanent than a glimpse.
Well, it's not permanent.
Right.
A glimpse is just a story about an individual that partially seems to disappear, and some aspect of what is seen. What this is coming from is that there isn't an individual. But that's the end of any kind of permanence. It's the end of any real objectified reality, which
Mhm.
was just part of the illusory experience of separation. It's the end of time as real. So there's no permanence, there's no continuity. It's
Yeah.
just this. It's simple, it's just this, but not as an objectification.
Another way I get at this will be the last way. Thinking of the Boltzmann brain, or thinking of a simulated consciousness.
Hmm.
Um, let's say we can create a human consciousness apparently through procreation. But if you imagine you simulated a human brain on a computer, let's say, and you can simulate smaller and smaller time scales. You can maybe put a life in a loop, or a day in a loop, or a
Hmm.
month in a loop, or a
Hmm.
second in a loop.
Hmm.
At what point is your simulation time frame so small that you've lost all consciousness, that there's no longer a moral hazard of the simulation, because it's a
Right.
single frame? It's a single frame. And this idea that a single frame of consciousness is nothing, a single
Hmm.
frame of consciousness is no experience at all. And this idea that all of consciousness is just the stacking of nothingness, on nothing on top of nothing on top of nothing. And that each frame in and of itself is nothing. And
Hmm.
if you try to stack nothing, you're somehow just left with nothing.
Yeah. Well, that is in a way what we're talking about, in a way,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because this is, you could say, nothing. It's nothing to the individual.
Yeah.
And the individual then, as a separate experience, stacks what is actually nothing, because it becomes something to its subjective reality. And it stacks those realities and it calls it its life.
If it's okay with you, if I could share a short quote
Yeah.
from Cormac McCarthy's recent book, The Passenger, where I think he touches on this paradox in the way that
Mm.
we're talking about stacking nothing on top of nothing. What
Mm.
happens when you try to zoom in on a moment of time? So,
Mm.
a quote from the book, he says, "A moment in time is a contradiction, since there could be no moveless thing.
Mm.
Time cannot be constricted into a brevity that contradicts its own definition.
Mm.
Conversely, the notion of the endlessly divisible in the world was attended by certain problems, while a discrete world, on the other hand, must raise the question as to what it is that connects it." And then he gives this image of a bird trapped in a barn that moves through the slats of light, bird by bird, whose sum is one bird.
Mm.
That's the end of the quote. But this visual image of the slats of light reflecting bird
Yeah.
by bird, which is like
Yeah.
the moving picture, whose
Mm.
sum is like one bird,
Mm.
and struggling with this question of a brevity that contradicts its own definition. Um,
Mm.
and what would connect the frames of time,
Mm.
if they were to be divided that way. I feel like is part of this paradox in a way.
Well, actually, what philosophy does in some instances, like that sounds very interesting, is it tries to, dive into experience or what can be known in an effort to find something more profound, something more true behind it all. And the what's truly sought, but that's not recognized until it's, let's say, seen by no one, is this as already everything. I'm really at a loss for words sometimes, but it really is just nothing to you. So what's sought is nothing to that separate experience. So it just has no value to it. So it can't be deduced,
Mm-hmm.
because the deduction is it as well. There's nothing that's not already that. And so there's no avenue to find it. And all the avenues are just part of the separate experience.
This has been such a joy and a pleasure. I find that there's like a joke, maybe like something that you would laugh at, or your audience would laugh at, is like applied non-duality.
Yeah.
like trying to take it and apply it.
Yeah.
But as absurd as it is, the thought, the perspective that time isn't linear, that this
Mm,
experience just exists in and of itself, and you don't know that it's going anywhere, that it came from
mm,
anywhere.
mm.
And in a sense of applying that, as again, as contradictory as that is,
Yeah.
to my own life, I do find valuable at times,
Mm.
when there's a certain receptiveness to that. So,
Yeah.
but there's appreciation here
Right. Well,
for
thanks.
the message. Can I end with one last quote? It's a Friedrich Nietzsche quote,
Mm.
reflecting on this universe, this world of ours, and the human drama. He says, "In some remote corner of the universe, poured out and glittering in innumerable solar systems, there once was a star on which clever animals invented knowledge. That was the highest and most mendacious minute of world history, yet only a minute. After nature had drawn a few breaths, the star grew cold, and the clever animals had to die.
Mm.
There have been eternities when it did not exist, and when it is done for again, nothing will have happened."
Yeah.
End quote. Is that perspective of sort of standing outside the drama? Is that
It is. It is a standing outside the drama, but what this is saying is that the drama is an illusion.
right?
The experience of separation is an illusion. It's not, it can't be confined to understanding or words. Not because it's limited, but because it is all understanding in words. There already isn't any separation.
Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you for your time. I'm incredibly grateful.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for having me.